Hello, my name is Leisia Tudor and I'm an agriculture manager at Dunbia. Welcome back to our Farm Green webinar series, where today I'm delighted to welcome Georgina Thomas from Trouw Nutrition. Georgina graduated from the University of Nottingham with a BSc in animal science before entering the feed industry to work as a ruminant nutritionist. Today, Georgina is the young animal feed manager for the GB business, as well as being member of the global ruminant innovation team for Trouw Nutrition. She has joined us today to talk about pre-lambing nutrition and colostrum management, and we'll also be discussing how managing both of these aspects correctly can improve on-farm sustainability. Sustainability is a strong focal point at Dunbia, and one of the aims of this webinar is to show that improving on-farm efficiency, and in this case efficiency during lambing, will not only help the farm's profitability, but will also help improve overall farm sustainability as well. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to you, Georgina.
So, as explained, today I will be focusing on optimising ewe nutrition and early life nutrition in lambs. As explained in my introduction, I'm hugely passionate about all areas of nutrition, but maternal nutrition and nutrition of the young animal really have a significant role to play in lifetime performance, which supports financial returns as well as a sustainable production system. So if we start by looking at some of the key discussion points I'm going to try and cover, the overall aim of our production systems when we define it is really to try and maximise lamb weight reared per ewe. And there's a number of different ways that we need to support doing that. The first one being a healthy ewe, as a healthy ewe will support a healthy lamb. So making sure we understand her nutritional requirements, as well as making sure that we are offering practical and achievable feeding systems is something that we'll focus on at the beginning of the presentation. Next, we really need to think about having this strong lamb vigour. We really want to encourage this lamb to get up and go as quickly as possible after birth. We really want to get them up and suckling, and we really want them to be focused on getting that good quality colostrum into them as soon as possible. Colostrum is something that you can spend all day talking about, particularly when it comes to early life nutrition and young animal feed. So I'll touch briefly on why colostrum is so important. There's a huge number of roles of colostrum within the body. It contains a huge amount of goodies, not just protein and energy. And understanding that in a little bit more detail can understand why we really should prioritise high quality new nutrition and intakes in that young lamb. Following the colostrum feeding, plentiful milk supply is also really important. So supporting that ewe to be healthy and productive is a focus for us. But also when we're looking at rearing cade or orphan lambs, making sure that we've got sufficient and digestible milk for those other lambs in order to optimise every lamb born is really important too. Finally, I'll summarise with other areas of nutritional support, for example, pre-weaning diarrhoea, but also trace elements. So trace elements are really important in order to support overall production and performance. So just making sure we're clear on a few of the key facts and findings around those, I'll try and summarise with a few points. So to start the presentation, I thought I'd start by looking at correct ewe nutrition. So as I mentioned in the introduction, an adequate and appropriate supply of nutrients to that ewe pre-lambing has a massive effect and a massive range of consequences on lamb performance. So for example, in this particular graph, we're showing lamb mortality correlated with birth weight. So as you can see here, the lamb birth weight directly correlates with the percentage of lamb mortality. So if we can support adequate ewe nutrition to ensure the birth weight of our lamb is optimal, we are in effect reducing the percentage of lamb mortality within our flock. So supporting an adequate birth weight really makes sure that they have got the tools and everything that they need to get up and get going and start feeding. So making sure that nutrition in that pre-lambing period is adequate and appropriate is really, really important, because it gives us that lamb that's going to be the foundation of our growing period. Ewe nutrition is also a major contributing factor to quantity and quality of colostrum available at birth. Making sure that ewe has adequate and appropriate nutrition is fueling the growth of that lamb, but also making sure that colostrum production cycle has started. We must remember that the colostrum production cycle will start around 5 weeks pre-lambing, so making sure we've got adequate energy, protein and nutrients going into that ewe at that point in time will really ensure that we've got quality and quantity of colostrum available at birth. And again, as you can see in the graphs on the right hand side, it's just looking at total lamb weight with regards to underfed or well-fed lambs and total volumes of colostrum as well. So showing the direct correlation there, again, between lamb size and intakes. Ewe nutrition as a production cycle has got many different aspects, as I'm sure we're all aware. I've simply split it into 4 production areas of the cycle. So pre-tupping, early pregnancy, late pregnancy and lambing to weaning. All are equally as important. The production cycle is circular, so making sure that ewes are in good condition, good form and good health to enter the next stage of the cycle is highly important. Ideally, the ideal would be a consistent body condition score throughout the year, but this really isn't practical or achievable due to the fluctuating nature of ewe requirements. Whether she's early pregnancy, late pregnancy or lactating, her requirements can massively differ. I've included some overall bullet points and some summary bullet points, but this time of year we'll focus on late pregnancy and lambing to weaning. So during late pregnancy, we're really aiming to have a body condition score target of 3. This makes sure she is in a good condition in order to support that growing lamb. We know that there's a large increase in energy requirements in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy due to the decreasing size of that rumen, due to the increasing size of that lamb. So making sure energy density of the diet, making sure that diet is palatable, making sure that we are focusing on encouraging intakes is something that is really important in that late pregnancy stage. It's also a hugely important time, a key time to try and avoid things like twin lamb disease. So making sure we are getting sufficient energy into that ewe in late pregnancy is really important. Following lambing, then the focus is on lambing to weaning. We know that some body condition score is inevitable. We're really trying to aim to minimise that body condition score loss. Lactation has huge energy and protein requirements, so making sure that we are tracking lamb and ewe performance and consider weaning if we believe that body condition score of that ewe is suffering. So making sure that we have got adequate forage, adequate supplementary feed during that progression from late pregnancy into that lactation performance setting is also so important. Making sure that we're feeding the ewe so that she can feed the lamb is a really high priority for us all. So I thought I'd then touch on a couple of slides around how much a ewe will eat, because if we understand her dry matter intake, then we can understand how we can look at balancing a diet. So I've just got a table here that is looking at identifying how much a ewe will potentially eat. So I've based it on, for example, a 70 kilo ewe, and we're looking at her intakes in the right-hand column in kilos a day. So when she's dry or post-weaning or early mid-pregnancy, she's probably going to be able to eat around 1.5% of her body weight. So that's just over a kilo. In late pregnancy, you can see the percentage of body weight goes up, her nutrient requirement increases, her dry matter intake increases. So you can then see her increase dry matter intake going up anywhere between sort of 1.45 to 1.75 kilos a day. And in early lactation, as I mentioned before, again, her nutrient requirements significantly increase. She's now got more rumen capacity. That lamb is no longer taking up a vast majority of her internal space. So as you can see, her dry matter intake significantly increases again, up to sort of 2.45 kilos a day. These are just rules of thumb figure, obviously based on percentage of body weight. So monitoring and measuring intakes and trying to make sure that we are satisfying that dry matter intake is really important. But making sure that we understand the production cycle and how potentially her dry matter intake changes can have a big impact on how we would look to feed her and potentially how we need to supplement her. We need to make sure that we're getting the megajoules and the grams of protein into her. So making sure we've got that balance between forage and supplementary feed is really important. Forage intakes is also something we should really focus on, particularly from a sustainability point of view. If we can focus on making good quality forage and focus on optimising the intake of that good quality forage, homegrown forage, then it really helps us to support a sustainable production system. Here I've just given an indication of the energy content of some different forages that we may see, categorised into average, good or poor, and then I've just split it into sort of 12 to 3 weeks pre-lambing and 3 weeks to just up to pre-lambing as well. And you can see the percentage of body weight from forage. As you would expect, the closer that she gets to lambing, due to the capacity of that rumen, due to that growing lamb, her dry matter intake drops. So we just need to make sure that we are still getting enough megajoules into her in order to support meeting her nutrient requirements. Good quality forage, palatable forage will always help to improve and drive dry matter intakes as well. So that's a really important thing for us to consider. So one of our focuses when thinking about nutrition throughout the year really should be having a main objective to optimise the contribution from homegrown forage. So optimising forage to support forage dry matter and nutrient intake should really be a key focus for us all. Prioritising making forage at the correct time will really help to ensure that we can capture as much energy and protein from that crop as possible. I would always recommend analysing our forage. Our forage can change from year to year depending upon the growing season. We've seen multiple different growing seasons, particularly over the last few years, when it comes to hot and dry weather or wet and cooler weather, and that has a really big impact on that grass growing phase and when that forage is ready to harvest. So every year I would definitely suggest making sure that we are analysing forage. If we analyse our forage, we can have a good idea of the nutrient content, so the energy and the protein, but also we can ensure that we are balancing it with the correct supplementary feed. Our forage changes year on year, therefore our supplementary feed may need to change year on year. So making sure that we are optimising the contribution from forage and pairing it with a complementary supplementary feed is really, really important. So we're aiming to optimise our forage intake, complement it with the minimal amount of supplement, really good quality supplement. And we really want to focus on using the correct type and quality of supplement for your feeding system, but also for your forage analysis too. So focusing on nutrition there for a few slides, the next thing that we really need to then think about is once these lambs arrive, making sure that they have the get up and go. Lamb vigour is something that we should always focus on. Making sure they are up and feeding as soon as possible has been shown to have a huge correlation with livability and survivability. So when we're looking at get up and go or lamb vigour, you can talk about it in a few different ways. We're really linking it to immunity and livability. So the time of that first colostrum feeding has a massive impact on immunity and mortality of that young lamb. So there's just a couple of slides or a couple of graphs here looking at colostrum intake. So on the left-hand side, you've got age at first feeding versus what we call the maximum serum IgG levels. So that's just giving us a good indication of how many of those goodies from that colostrum have entered the bloodstream and have really been able to have their full effects. And as you can see, the younger or the lower the age at first feeding, the higher the level of the max serum IgG. So we're looking at getting that colostrum into that lamb as soon as possible. And that's all to do with how the lamb gut develops. So over time, the intestinal cells that line the gut of that young lamb start to mature, and the ability of those large protein molecules, those IgG molecules that are really going to fuel that lamb's immunity, the ability of those IgGs to cross the gut cell wall and get into the bloodstream really reduce. So making sure that we are prioritising colostrum feeding and colostrum intakes within those first few hours is really important. The right hand slide then correlates that with mortality. So as you can see, the later that we feed colostrum to lambs, the higher the level of potential mortality. So you can just see the correlation there between getting that really good IgG level through into that lamb, and then making sure that we also reduce the potential mortality level as well. The role of colostrum, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the role of colostrum really is multifactorial. There's a huge number of different nutrients and goodies within colostrum that have a huge impact on lamb performance. I've just included a quote here from a young animal feed researcher from the US, and they highlight that achieving early and adequate intake of high quality colostrum is widely recognised as the single most important management factor in determining the health and survival of neonates. So making sure that we have high levels of good quality colostrum into that young lamb is one of the best things that we can do. So we know that colostrum contains all of the essential maternal antibodies, and that really helps a young lamb to initiate their own immune function. We know that colostrum offers the first source of nutrition, so it contains proteins, fats, lactose, minerals and vitamins, and they support growth and muscle development and assist in the setup of the immune system. Colostrum is a powerhouse of nutrition. It contains between 7 and 13% fat, 2 and 5% lactose, and 7 to 10% protein, so it's really packed with nutrition. Alongside the nutrition aspect, there's a huge number of what we call bioactive components within colostrum. So colostrum contains hormones, antimicrobials, anti-inflammatory factors. So they are there to provide a number of different functions, many of which are still being researched and not quite understood yet. But many of these bioactive components have a key role in stimulating the development of the digestive tract. So making sure that the digestive tract is clear post-lambing, but making sure those gut cells lining the intestines start to develop and are able to support nutrient uptake and absorption. We know that the gut has a huge role in defending against pathogens. So the gut is a really important area of the body that really helps to protect us and protect that young lamb against pathogens getting into the bloodstream and causing systemic infections. So defending against pathogens is really, really important. There was also some nice research that looked at actually increasing colostrum ingestion, so making sure that that young lamb is getting sufficient colostrum, had actually been shown to increase rectal temperatures, so make sure that that lamb's body temperature is sufficient in order to reduce the risk of hypothermia. And also it's been shown to improve the level of circulating glucose in the blood. And circulating glucose obviously is that energy source that that lamb's going to need to absorb and grow. So colostrum really is liquid gold. And making sure that we've got an adequate supply coming from that ewe, and making sure we're supporting getting that good quality colostrum into that lamb as soon as possible is really, really important. There's quite a lot of new research coming out and looking at the importance of colostrum within lambs, and really some of the impacts are really long term and really should be an important consideration for our sustainable production cycle. For example, there's some work looking at the potential to improve efficiency and productivity of the flock. So as I've shown, and as other work research shows, the importance of colostrum links to minimising lamb losses, as well as maximising efficiency in that growing period, which is really important part of what we need to consider. What's also interesting is the colostrum intake has a massive impact during the lifetime of that animal. So it has a huge potential to improve the future production of your flock too. So for example, it supports the development of the intestinal tract, as I've mentioned, but that's going to be really important from a feed conversion efficiency point of view, making sure that we're getting the most out from the feed that we're putting in. Supports the development of other tissues and organs, including the liver, the kidney, the spleen and the muscles. And often many of these organs are the driving force behind that growing lamb, but also for our replacement flock as well, making sure that they have the organs required to support a productive lifetime performance is really important. There's some work now looking at promoting the reproductive tract of the male and female progeny as well. so of our breeding flock. There's quite a lot of work now looking at future offspring fertility. So, for example, it's been shown to affect uterine and cervical developments in the female, and colostrum consumption has also been shown to affect testicular development too, and that's even within the first few days. So it's crazy to think that actually that first feed can have such important effects from a development point of view and from a reproductive point of view as well. It also then, due to that reason, increases our reproductive performance with regards to reaching puberty earlier. And there's a lot of work out there linking colostrum intake to improving our future milk volumes and constituents. So making sure that we can optimise what our ewes are able to produce to feed the future generations as well. So colostrum isn't only just about immunity and IgG provision, it's about improving efficiency and productivity of our flock, as well as looking at the potential to improve the future productions of our animals. So we know that colostrum is the first step. I always say colostrum is the foundation for milk feeding. So what is the objective of the milk feeding phase? We're really hoping to support and help those lambs to achieve their full growth potential. Once that lamb is born, we really want to optimise and maximise their potential in order to get as much as we can from that lamb in that growing phase. So there's a few considerations we need to look at when we're feeding lambs during that milk feeding phase. Obviously, when we're supporting ewe nutrition, she's going to be hopefully supplying an adequate supply of digestible milk. However, when we're looking at artificially rearing lambs, which is part of what we do every year, there are 4 key considerations for milk feeding phase. So one is thinking about energy density. Making sure we've got sufficient energy density. The second one is protein digestibility. We really want to be feeding our orphan or arcade lambs a protein that is highly digestible and is as close to that protein as ewe's milk. We really want to be focusing on osmolality. Now, osmolality is a term that explains looking at the mineral and sugar content. So making sure that we have got an appropriate osmolality value is really important to make sure that we can reduce the risk of nutritional scour and any bloating, particularly within the first few days and weeks of that young lamb. So making sure that we are monitoring and measuring our sugar and mineral content is really important as well. And finally, mineral and vitamin supplementation. There are a number of vitamins and minerals such as vitamin E and selenium that have a huge important role in the immunity of that young lamb. So just focusing on energy density very briefly, we know that the first hazard that our young lamb has to face is the dramatic drop in ambient temperature. It has become nicely accustomed to 39 degrees in utero, but we know that when that lamb is born, it's not necessarily born into that nice, comfy environment. We know that newborn lambs have a large surface area to body weight ratio, and therefore we know there are significant draws on energy reserves to maintain body temperature, and we know that lambs will rapidly succumb to hypothermia if we have not fed them sufficiently. Just a diagram. This is just a diagram overview looking at the main causes of lamb mortality, but actually the 2 main causes are exposure and starvation and infectious disease. And as I mentioned before, this is due to the hypothermia risk. They have a large surface area to body weight ratio, so actually they risk losing heat very, very quickly. They have limited energy reserves. They are born with minimal amounts of brown fat and minimal amounts of a layer of fat. So their energy reserves are actually very low. And the other thing to consider is the adverse weather conditions and or the lack of shelter can exacerbate those issues. So depending upon whether we're lambing inside or outside, depending upon what the season wants to do, whether we've got rain, sunshine or snow, the weather conditions can have a big impact on that lamb's nutrient requirement and that lamb's energy requirement. So making sure that we are sufficiently feeding them to reduce those risks are really important. And that's just an overview table of looking at the body temperature of the lamb and the risk of infection. So Moving on from energy, protein's really important, particularly when looking at a replacement milk supplement. So when looking at a lamb milk replacer to feed those cade or orphan lambs, we really want to be focusing on supporting and developing the same sort of protein digestibility that we're seeing in ewe milk. So we really want to be feeding a milk replacer that is as good as used milk, or as close to used milk as possible. So when we look at options and sourcing, we're often looking at skimmed milk or milk proteins or whey proteins. And as you can see, just focusing on the protein digestibility column there, you can see these are very digestible to a young animal from a very young age. When we start to look at different options, so there's some vegetable proteins that we can see, such as hydrolyzed wheat protein or soya protein concentrates or soya bean meals, you can just see the protein digestibility starts to drop away, or the age at which that young animal can utilize some of those protein sources starts to become extended. So we know we only have a brief period, 35 days potentially, to rear this young lamb on milk replacer. So optimizing protein source is really important. So focusing on choosing your lamb milk replacer, focusing on milk proteins, so skim milk and whey proteins, and minimizing the inclusion of some of those vegetable proteins can give you some massive performance benefits with regards to feed conversion efficiency, but can also make sure that we are supporting a healthy level of growth too. So the next consideration when we're looking at considering a lamb milk replacer for those artificially reared lambs is the term osmolality. As I mentioned, osmolality is a fairly new term, but we're looking at it measuring the concentration of particles in a solution. And it's really calculated by adding the concentration of sugars and minerals together. So for example, if we were mixing a jug of lamb milk replacer, all it is doing is counting how many mineral and sugar molecules are within that jug of mixed milk replacer. So for example, if we start to mix that milk replacer more concentrated, the osmolality is going to increase. If we start to mix a milk replacer that has got a high level of sugars or minerals in, the osmolality is also going to increase. Osmolality is really important because although it's a new term and some of the research is emerging and has been coming out over the last 4 or 5 years, osmolality or osmosis actually defines how water moves within the body of that lamb. And that's important for a number of different reasons. But if we start to look at feeding lamb milk replacers with a high level of concentration or with a high level of osmolality, there's a few things that can happen. So it can potentially damage the gut integrity. So what can happen is it can have an effect on the gut cell walls that line the intestine, and those gut cells can start to move a little bit further apart. If those gut cells start to move a little bit further apart, we risk that pathogens or other molecules can actually pass across the gut and get into the bloodstream and potentially cause some health problems as well. So keeping a really strong gut integrity is really important from an immune function and a lamb health point of view. The next point is associated with abomasal bloat. Bloat potentially can be a problem that we see in young milk-fed lambs. And really what happens is they feed milk, so from a bottle or from a teat, and it goes into that first stomach, so into that abomasum. What then happens is that abomasum actually thinks, oh, this is quite concentrated. This milk's got quite a high level of osmolality. And actually what it tries to do is it slows down its emptying rate. So it slows down the rate at which it allows milk to go from that stomach into the intestine, because it's trying to protect that intestine. But unfortunately, the lamb then becomes at much higher risk of abomasal bloat. So although it's trying to protect its intestine, it's actually increasing the risk of abomasal bloat. And abomasal bloat can be a significant problem when looking at rearing cade lambs. So it's something that we definitely need to think about. The other issue potentially with feeding a high concentration or a high osmolality lamb milk replacement for these young lambs is diarrhea and scour within those first few weeks. So, for example, if the abomasum lets that concentrated fluid go through into the intestines, what happens is the body realises that that milk feed is quite concentrated, and it will take water out of the tissues, it will take water out of the bloodstream, and it will dump it back into that gut lumen, which then gives us a nutritional scour. So osmolality is a very new term. It's something that we don't talk about very much when feeding artificially reared or caged lambs. But as you can see, it can have a really big impact on health and performance. And managing some of those issues, so those bloat issues and those scour issues we potentially may experience in those first few weeks, can have a massive impact on how we rear lambs, because it can be a tough job, and making sure that we're making things as easy as possible and supporting lamb health and performance is really important. So we're really looking at considering osmolality levels, really to focus on lamb scour and reducing the risk of abomasal bloat. So it's a new term that is being talked about, but it's really important for us to consider. So moving on from milk feeding, really to look at the importance of trace minerals. So trace minerals are required by the ewe and the lamb. They're essential for a number of different functions, and they are required in very small amounts, but they are required every single day. So we need to make sure that we have a consistent supply going in order to meet lamb or ewe requirements. So the first point is that correct supplementation of trace minerals is vitally important and has been shown to improve ewe health as well as support lamb survivability and vigour. So there are a number of different vitamins and trace elements that you can focus on, but I've included here just a few of the key ones that get talked about fairly often when it comes to looking at analysing ewe compounds or supplementary ewe feeds, or when it comes to looking at creep feeds or milk feeds for that young lamb. So when you look at vitamin E and selenium, they very much work together. They work synergistically. One works outside of a cell and one works inside of a cell, but they're really important for immunity and health. So they're essential for lamb vigour, that get up and go. They're essential for supporting, reducing the risk of hypothermia, have been shown to have really important role in reducing the risk of ewe mastitis as well. So vitamin E and selenium definitely work together in order to support that immune function. So making sure that we've got adequate supplies of both as they work in tandem is really important. The second one is cobalt or vitamin B12. So we feed cobalt to a ewe. Her rumen bugs utilise the cobalt and produce vitamin B12, but both are very involved in energy functions, so producing and maintaining energy for that ewe in order to produce enough milk for her lamb. So making sure we've got sufficient cobalt, which turns into vitamin B12, is really important. It allows lambs particularly to stand and suckle earlier. It makes sure we're getting that good quality nutrition into them as early as possible. Iodine is another one, another trace mineral that's important in potentially protecting against hypothermia. And zinc is one that we often talk about, but again, is highly important. So zinc is involved in skin integrity and gut integrity, and making sure that we are supporting them to produce healthy and growing cell linings. So important against things like mastitis and lameness. Careful selection of sources is also really important. So when looking at trace elements, it's really important to see where they come from, what is the source of that trace element. Making sure that they are highly digestible, highly available will really help to optimise the utilisation within that ewe and lamb as well. And minerals are really key. Mineral nutrition is a key consideration in all stages of the production cycle. So the tupping through to early pregnancy, late pregnancy and lactation. Mineral nutrition really is key in all stages of the production cycle because they have so many functions within that animal. So just to finalise, I just thought I'd give an overview of sustainability. So in our sheep production cycle, we really do have the opportunity to improve sustainability by optimising the resilience and robustness in both our ewes and our lambs. So here at Trouw Nutrition, we are focusing on sustainability and making sure that we are trying to make it applicable to the segmented sheep industry and the requirements per section of the market. So optimising resilience and disease in the ewe and lamb really will help us to support lambing percentage and survivability. And again, you can see that we've split it down into stages with regards to pre-tupping all the way through until finishing of that lamb. And we're really trying to focus on some target areas with regards to fertility, condition, productivity, growth, etc., etc. But there are some key messages, and really it's looking at supporting and supporting good quality healthy animals in order for them to be productive and sustainable too. So just to summarise with some take-home points, ewe nutrition is crucial to support early life nutrition in the young lamb. Prioritising the importance of colostrum and the huge number of roles that it plays can support the best possible start in life. Don't forget the influence of lambing environment on colostrum requirements. So, for example, weather can massively exacerbate things. So making sure that we've got a sufficient colostrum going in depending upon what that environment is bringing. Appropriate milk feeding of artificially reared lambs can support optimal performance. Making sure they're getting the best out of those cade lambs is really important and can be a huge part of that sustainable production system. And finally, vitamins and trace elements can influence all stages of the production cycle. So mineral nutrition definitely shouldn't be forgotten within the wider scope of nutrition. So thank you all for listening to the webinar, and I think we'll take some questions.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Georgina. I think you've really highlighted the importance of correct ewe nutrition, especially during late lambing, and also that colostrum management is key for the future production of not just your lambs at lambing time, but also your whole flock. So we have a few questions for you. So the first one is, what is the difference in management between a ewe lamb and an aged ewe in terms of nutrition at lambing, and what are the key things to look out for?
So there are going to be some significant differences when it comes to a ewe lamb and an aged lamb. We need to remember that ewe lamb is probably still growing and probably still developing. So her nutrient requirement is just not solely focused on that growing lamb. We need to make sure that we are supporting her body condition score and supporting her nutrient intake to make sure she's not losing too much body condition score. So monitoring her body condition score and nutrient intake is really important. Her dry matter intake, due to her size and therefore her rumen size, is probably going to be lower than that aged lamb, particularly when looking whether they're housed together or separately. That's an important consideration. Often if ewe lambs are housed with aged lambs, then access to feedstuffs or feeding fences can be limited due to just hierarchy in flocks. So that's another important one to consider. So yeah, that ewe lamb definitely will need more nutrients and more monitoring and more looking after than that aged ewe, because that aged ewe is focusing really on producing colostrum or starting the production of colostrum and growing that lamb in the final stages. She doesn't necessarily have to consider growing and continuing to grow for herself as well.
So the next question we've got is, what is the best crop for in-lamb ewes to maximise energy and the feed value of the crop? And then are there any crops then that shouldn't be grazed at certain periods during the pregnancy?
So I think when it comes to understanding your crop, analysis is always going to be what's really important. So if we start to look at forages, for example, first, then when you start to look at grass forages, so conserved grass forages over dried grass forages such as straw and hay, they have a more nutrient dense profile. So looking for a good quality grass silage will always supply more energy and protein in that dry matter intake than potentially straw and hay will. So straw and hay will just require further supplementation. So when it comes to sort of those conserved forages that we're looking for in that in that sort of late pregnancy stage. It's just making sure that we're almost looking at energy density, because her dry matter intake is going to be so limited due to the growing lamb. We need to make sure that we're getting as much energy through that forage. So conserved green forages, as grass silages go, are going to be higher energy density compared to straw and hay. Doesn't mean straw and hay can't be used. It just means they're going to be supplemented differently. And then when it comes to other crops, we just need to be careful around fermentability. So, for example, feeding a lot of barley or feeding something that's quite fizzy in the rumen will just need to be managed, because what we don't want to do at that stage in lambing is cause any acidosis or cause any stomach upsets, because her dry matter intakes will absolutely fall through the floor, and it will take a few days to recover. So you can almost put yourself backwards. So it's just making sure we're feeding enough fibre to support that rumen, but also making sure that we are getting an energy dense form of forage into them. So when it comes to crops, I would always say analyse, and you know what you've got, and then you can balance it. You can make most things work. If you've got the analysis, then you know how to supplement it.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then sort of on the same sort of topic, then you advise testing your forage every year, as it will change depending on the silage and the hay that you make. So what are the most important aspects that you should be looking for on this analysis, and what kind of figures would you expect?
So the first thing that's really important is to make sure that when you're sampling that forage, you are taking a representative sample. So I know that can be difficult, particularly with big bales, or however you're storing your forage, but we need to make sure that you are getting enough samples from bales and mixing them together. If you're using clamp silage, making sure that we are taking different samples from across the face, making sure we're say mixing them in a bucket and then taking a smaller sample of that mixed forage to send off for analysis. Sort of taking one grab from a bale or one grab from a clamp face, for example, might not necessarily be very representative. So the sampling is massively important. Sending it off then to a reputable lab pretty quickly. So we don't want it sitting there in a plastic bag for a few days, because that can change the nutrient profile as well. So making sure that it's sent off rapidly for analysis. And we're really looking for ME, protein, and some fermentability factors as well. Most labs will help you, or most feed compounders will help you with regards to pointing in the right direction of a report. A lot of people have a sheep forage report, so definitely ask about that, and that should give you the nutrients that you need.
Brilliant, thank you. And you mentioned as well about sort of trace elements. Which nutritional deficiency is most damaging in UK sheep flocks lambing, and then how is this best prevented?
I think when you look at undersupplying, forages aren't great supplements for vitamins and minerals. It's very difficult to analyse for vitamins in forages due to the fact that they're just quite difficult to measure. So I would definitely be looking at vitamin and selenium, potentially trying to understand the levels of that. Obviously, when it comes to sheep, copper is an important consideration. Deficiencies, not too much of a challenge, but toxicities can be a massive challenge. And zinc again, and cobalt and vitamin B12. So really it's, I've kind of mentioned all of them there, but it really is important to get all of these essential trace elements. Having the balance is really important. But if we're feeding good quality forage, we need to make sure that we cover the supplementation of vitamins and minerals in the supplementary feed, because unfortunately conserved forages aren't great suppliers of those.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And then you've obviously highlighted the importance of colostrum, and like you said, colostrum is gold. And then is there a way to test colostrum on farm then? Is there milk colostrum from the ewe?
Yes, there's a couple of different ways you can test the colostrum. So some are more practical than others. There's a few tools that you can buy. So there's such a thing called a colostrometer. That's a glass instrument. It has to be used, or it's best used at sort of 20 to 21 degrees. So probably wouldn't be very practical in many of our lambing sheds because it's based on bulk density of the colostrum. The easiest one to use would be probably a refractometer. And there's lots of guides. If you Google guides on refractometers, you can buy them on Amazon for £15 or £20. And basically what that's looking at is identifying the IgG content. So those good immunoglobulins that are going to support. It's a small piece of kit. You just have to drop a small piece of colostrum onto like a glass plate, and then you look through the refractometer, and it will give you a reading, and that will correlate to colostrum quality. So refractometers is probably the easiest and most practical thing that you can use on farm to monitor your U quality colostrum.
And then we've just got one more question then on colostrum side of things. So you mentioned milk replacements and then the importance of looking for one with good protein content. If a farmer needed to substitute colostrum, is cow colostrum okay, or would you recommend turning towards the powdered colostrum instead?
There your two options are. So cow colostrum, as long as it's clean, hygienically stored and collected and of good quality, it's a good option potentially, because it will have some of the hormones and the bioactive components that we've mentioned. When it comes to looking for a replacer, it's really looking for a high quality replacer. So make sure that freeze-dried colostrum or colostrum is the first thing on the composition list, and really try and ask about the IgG content. So a lot of colostrums will be sold based on IgG content, and understanding the IgG content of that colostrum powder will help you figure out how much you need to feed, because we know how much colostrum, natural colostrum, a lamb needs, and therefore we can replicate that with a colostrum replacer. And again, making sure when we're mixing up colostrum replacers, we're following the instructions. We don't want to mix it too concentrated, because it can be quite difficult to get down a tube and into that lamb, but also to make sure that the sugar and mineral content isn't too high, which can cause some diarrhea aspects. So you've got both options. I think the bovine colostrum, I'd just be really careful about how it's stored, cooled, and we all know that bacteria in colostrum can double every 20 minutes. So storage and hygienic collection is going to be really important if you go down that route.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we'll wrap it up there. So I'd just like to close by thanking you, Georgina, for your time today, and really highlighting those key points for us all to think about. It's been a really informative session, so thank you very much.